And great. Okay, so it started recording. We have about 16 participants right now, and I really am excited about that. If you could please, let's see, I was going to ask somebody else. I'm going to do the slides. So we're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves. So Vanessa, would you like to begin?
Hi, everyone. I am Vanessa Timmons, as she, her pronouns. I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I will have my camera off for most of the time. I'm in Camas, Washington area, and we are having tremendous bandwidth problems this afternoon. So just know that I'm delighted that you're here. I'm delighted to be here with you, and you will see me intermittently as I'm able. Thank you, Carrie.
Thanks. And I'm Carrie Moran Kuhn. I use she, her pronouns as well, and I'm the Associate Director at the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. I'm going to invite Rowan to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rowan Schwartz. I'm the Executive Administrative Assistant at OCADSVA. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm just here to help out with any tech issues and make sure that things are rolling. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the chat.
Thanks, Rowan. And Leah, since you were able to join us today, are you able to introduce yourself? Because Leah Seavey will be doing some more work on this project. So you'll be seeing her when you go to those Wednesday meetings at the third Wednesday of every month. So Leah, if you don't mind.
Hi, everybody. This is Leah Seavey, and I am the Director of Capacity and Programming, and I'm thrilled to be here. Welcome, everybody.
Wonderful. Thanks, Leah. So I see some more folks are joining us. This is great. And Emily, thank you for getting it going. So because we have so much content, we are not going to unmute. But if what you can do is type your name, pronouns, and the organization you're with into the chat box, that's wonderful. And that really helps us also gather for our records for this grant, who was here already. And it also lets us make sure that we follow up with the correct information. I did email to the entire listserv PDF version of the PowerPoint and some handouts for today. So we will make sure to get that to you. If for some reason you didn't get them, let us know in the chat box with your email, and Rowan will capture that for us and we'll get those out to you. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get going. This is just a little bit about us, the Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. You can find our website, more about us on our website. So today, after the end of this webinar, webinar number 3, you'll be better able to screen and inquire about domestic violence. You'll be better able to determine the risks and identify survival strategies. You'll have more understanding of survivors' needs for housing, safety, legal help. Oh, there's missing a comma, parenting, and healthcare. A variety of resources towards the end today. And you'll better be able to hopefully integrate domestic violence knowledge into your clinical practice. And you'll also learn more about ways to adapt clinical models and interventions for domestic violence survivors. So just a real quick recap from webinar number 2. I know not everyone was able to go, and if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, we went and did a deep dive into confidentiality and privilege. We talked about the Oregon statute and specifically how that interacts with the domestic violence advocates. Very important for you all who are partnering and doing handoffs and working with your local domestic violence providers, the community-based programs or tribal nations, just to really understand what Oregon's advocate privilege statute is and how it's different than some other privileged categories. Also where our confidentiality lies in our federal statute, the Violence Against Women Act. So we did a really deep dive into that. We talked about some population-specific privacy concerns. We talked a lot about why our privilege and confidentiality are so focused, why we're not mandatory reporters, the majority of advocates, that's not in the advocate privilege law, and why releases of information best practices, how time limited, specific, and why in regards to domestic violence and stalking and sexual violence, why it's about safety, really, in addition to privacy. And we talked a lot about how domestic violence organizations do protect their information and how that, to be aware of how to protect you, if you're not already aware, how to be aware of how your organization, how your mental health clinic handles subpoenas, handles that kind of information, especially when you're working with domestic violence survivors. So that's just a real brief review from the webinar number 2. Now I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa, and we're going to go into integrating domestic violence into clinical practice.
Thanks, Carrie. So in the handouts that Carrie sent out, one of the handouts is a telehealth consent form. And that comes to you from one of the advisory team that I formed to kind of inform these webinars. So I have a group of counselors and practicing therapists and medical doctors' assistants who have been kind of informing me around some of the specifics of your clinical practice and where you might need more information around domestic and sexual violence. And they sent that telehealth consent form you all's way. And it's in a Word document so that you can adapt it as needed. So I hope that's helpful for you. And the next couple of slides is integrating domestic violence into clinical practice. The question I asked to my advisory team was, what are the top 3 things that you struggle with when doing domestic violence support and counseling in your clinical practice? And so I'm just going to go over these from, these are their kind of for us, by us answers for you all, and I hope that they're helpful to kind of guide your practice. So the first thing that came up over and over from all of my team, there's about 7 of them, was safety planning, that the number 1 challenge for them as counselors, therapists, addictions support folks and counselors and medical professionals is that when they're doing their screening and they're assessing for domestic and sexual violence, and it's time to kind of launch into safety planning, that's just a struggle because it's so intermittent. Because I asked, like, what's hard about that? And it's that, you know, safety planning is such an individual practice. Like, every safety plan is unique and different. The safety planning questions can be kind of challenging to come up with, and it's a chunky or difficult conversation to have with a survivor. So I just want you to know that that's really where your DVSA advocate and partnership will come in. You can absolutely pass the safety planning task off to the domestic and sexual violence advocates that you're working directly with. I think that they can be a real support for you. They could either you know, hop on the phone and talk you through safety planning, or they can, you could do a collaborative safety plan where you bring the advocate in and you and the advocate are chatting, or you can just give a referral and say, you know, I think safety planning would be a great next step. And I have a partner that I work with in the DVSA community, and here's their contact information. So there's lots of ways for you to address that. And so I wanted to start there. The second one is dreaming a life, making a plan for that life to independence. And this is really about when you're working with a survivor, and this came from an addictions counselor, when you're working with a survivor and they're really trying to rebuild after domestic violence. This is someone who's a little more, you know, is a little safer, or maybe they're working with child welfare and there's some sort of requirement that they not have contact with their the person who caused harm to them or their child. And so that creating a plan for that next step, and how do we dream and vision? And I know that that is one of those things you'll want to integrate and think about deeply as you're doing your practice, right? What are those conversations that you'll want to have? And just knowing that this is an important conversation to have when working with survivors. What do the next 6 months look like? What does the next year look like? What does a life without violence feel like? What's going to be necessary for you to build that life? And then I think the rebuilding self-esteem is an important one. And this comes from a counselor in a rural community who just said that the shame can be not just individual, but community, right? There's a lot of, in smaller communities, more rural communities, there's a lot of community members taking sides. Maybe there's a little bit of gossip. I think this probably shows up in culturally specific or smaller communities where the survivor is working to rebuild or make sense of the violence in their relationship on their own, but also the community can bring another layer to that. And so just having that conversation and recognizing that it's an important conversation to have in your clinical practice, specifically when working with domestic violence survivors. Do you have any questions about the 3 bullets that I've shared or what we've talked about so far? Before I go to the next one, you can just put those in the chat. Rome will let me know if you have questions there. So Carrie, we can go to the next slide. So the next one, important therapists, and I think we've talked about this actually. We've talked a lot about knowing the patterns of domestic violence and how they work. And if you haven't watched the other 2 slides, there's quite a bit there on this one. And this is just another reminder to know that folks who are actually doing this every day, working in their clinical practice, really are noting the importance of recognizing those patterns. And I would say the reason that's so important when you're doing addictions work or therapeutic work is that the patterns are going to show up. They may have a different quality, a different texture. They're going to be wearing different clothes, as I say, but it's the same pattern of coercion, power and control, manipulation, and violence. And you want to be able to recognize that in whatever shape or form it shows up in the relationship or in the work that you're doing. And this one's an important one, I think, for folks who might be doing, and I don't think there's anyone in our project that's doing this, but who's working with both perpetrators and survivors. It's just understanding the difference between conflict, relationship conflict, and domestic and sexual violence, right? And really realizing that those are 2 specific bodies of work. And as a therapist, you're going to be doing both. As advocates, we don't do both, right? So this is something that they really wanted to have you think about is how do you do that work when you might be working with, or someone else in your organization is working with the person who caused harm and you're working with the survivor, and there might be conflict or relationship issues in addition to the domestic violence dynamics, and that you want to absolutely recognize those as 2 separate conditions and 2 separate issues. And then this person's mentioned the honeymoon period and the recording period, and just recognizing those as tactics of domestic violence. Those are not necessarily, the survivor being in denial or being relapsing or some of the other ways this can show up. This is a specific tactic of power and control and manipulation. And it's part of the cycle of violence, and it's one of those patterns that we want to watch out for and just not accidentally shame a survivor because those things can look like relapse. Support. Yeah, and I think that helping survivors walk through the dynamic of fighting back, I think it's very common. I know it's common in my own practice to work with survivors who've been incarcerated for domestic violence for fighting back, survivors who have lost children because of fighting back, or survivors who have, just really been identified as violent themselves. I think that specifically happens in culturally specific communities, BIPOC communities, but it can happen to any survivor. I'm sure you've probably had that experience with survivors where it's more complex than just victim survivor, that, these are very complicated relationships, and helping the survivor talk through that is part of the therapeutic process, is what I'm hearing. So just kind of be aware of those ways that you're going to be as clinicians. These are ways that you can kind of integrate domestic and sexual violence work into your day-to-day clinical practice. So Carrie, do you have anything to add to that? Okay.
I don't. I think those are all excellent. Excellent.
Okay. And Rowan, were there any questions?
Nope.
Okay, great. So the next thing I want to, we can go to the next slide. This is a slide that what we're going to talk about now is really thinking about what are some of those practices that you can do to build a vigorous, healthy domestic and sexual violence response within your mental health setting. The handout that I think is very helpful for this, there's a handout that you have called, it's like 10 steps to create a comprehensive domestic violence healthcare response. It's from Futures Without Violence. Wonderful resource from them, but I've included that little document. If you go to their website, there's so much more there than just what I have here. But I just want to talk about some of the key things that are very, very important. And the first one is setting up a collaborative work group. We're so grateful for Oregon Health Authority for reaching out to the coalition. That's part of what we're here to do for you all. That's part of the partnerships that you have with your community partners. But just know that having that collaborative work group is such an important step for integration, and know that that work group is, once you get that in place, it's not a short-term community. That's something that you want to maintain and nourish over time to just deepen your response in your community. I think most of this, the only other thing I want to make a note of here is we're going to talk a lot about protocol in a little bit. Developing a domestic violence protocol is an incredibly important thing for you to do. I hope that you all will do that and within the first 6 months of your collaboration. I hope that you'll work really well with your community partners to develop this protocol. My vision is that each of you will have one at the end of this project. I've included one as a handout for you. It's from a Los Angeles it's like a Los Angeles healthcare community. It's like 14 or 15 pages long. So you don't have to do that, of course. But I gave you that one because it has a lot of generative questions, a lot of places for discussion in it. So I hope that you'll just kind of jump in and look at that and take the information that I'm about to share with you about developing protocols, and that can be a good place for you to start. Carrie, we can go to the next slide. So the other thing is really developing a universal assessment and education process. And this is really important because for survivors that are coming in for mental health counseling, we want to make certain that everyone who's coming into your system, whether it's an addictions program, a mental health clinic, a suicide prevention project, a parenting program, you know, a wellness center, that whatever door is entered through, that there is an assessment and a universal response, universal education about domestic violence, universal response. We want people to feel that it's a normal conversation to talk about these issues, right? That it's normalized, that we know that this is a critical issue in our community and that we're ready to respond to it. So that is a really important part. And I think that what I would add to that is making sure that our universal education assessment and response is also culturally relevant and in multiple languages, right? That you've thought about who is marginalized in my community, who is least likely to be seen as a survivor of domestic and sexual violence, and make sure they're included in your universal response. And this is just increasing awareness. And when I talk about increasing awareness, what I've learned by working in the mental health field is that there's often a lot of stigma attached to domestic and sexual violence. And when we increase awareness, we reduce stigma. And so these are some of the first steps we can make that are going to have a significant impact in our community. And what you'll notice when you do this awareness campaign and kind of this universal, thoughtful process is that more survivors are going to show up. And it's not that all of a sudden there's more survivors. What's happened is that we've created an environment where survivors feel comfortable telling us what's happening. and trusting us to be partners with them in responding and intervening and preventing the domestic violence that's happened in their community or could happen. So Carrie, I'm ready for the next slide. So we're going to talk about how do we change our models, right? How do we change what we're doing to make room for domestic violence work? Like, what does that look like? You know, that, you know, we were doing one thing one way, and we've had some bits about domestic and sexual violence, but now we want to practice in a more vigorous way. And how do we do that? How do we make room for this new thing, or how do we grow our existing process? And the first thing, and I know that you all know this, but it's just something we always, I think it's important for us to say, is we have to prioritize safety at every single level when we're doing domestic violence work. Safety has to be central. Whatever conversation you're having, whatever work you're doing, at whatever level you're doing it, keep safety in the front of your mind and allow it to be integrated in every step of the way, from how the doors are opened, how the intake happens, how the exit happens, what follow-up looks like, what reporting looks like. I know that the last three, this is our third webinar, and I know in the first two, we talked a lot about safety. Advocates are going to always talk about safety because we know that if it's not centered, really terrible things can happen. And I talked about universal screening and assessment. So I also want to talk a little bit about follow-up. I think referral we've talked quite a bit about, but I want to talk about follow-up. And because when we do this clinical, you know, when we're making room for domestic violence work, the follow-up is as important as the intake. Because, you know, going back to a survivor or going back to a client and checking in. How did our interventions work? How are you feeling 6 months down the road about the conversation we had 6 months ago about you and your partner? That follow-up becomes part of the intervention. And so really building that out to capture emerging needs, because domestic violence is a continuum. The follow-up becomes part of how you capture like what else is happening, how it's grown and changed, how the violence has progressed, or how your intervention has interrupted that cycle, and what new opportunities might be born of that. So just making room for vigorous follow-up in your clinical practice. Carrie, is there anything you would add to that?
I just liked what you said about safety, and then even in the follow-up. So, you know, are they still living with the abuser, and how are you going to plan for that? Is there stalking happening? Yeah, I think just the whole weaving safety through everything is so important. Oops, I didn't mean to advance the slide. Are there questions?
Thanks.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, Vanessa.
Okay, thank you. And please feel free to, I mean, I know we're moving quickly and we have a lot of content, but I really do, this is your training, and I really want to be available to you to answer questions that are emerging. There's no, you know, all questions are really welcome. We will slow down and answer those if they rise. Okay, Carrie. Next slide. Okay, so protocol. So the basics of a protocol, and I'm not going to go through every single one of these for sure, but I am going to pick out the ones that I think are really important. You know, I've worked on probably hundreds of protocols, from Kaiser Permanente to Youth Authority to Multnomah County, Aging and Disabilities. And what I will tell you is that every domestic violence protocol should be unique to your system. You know, I offered, you have the template because that's really it's a good one, and it has a lot of really good information in it. But know that your protocol could be 5 things. It really can. It can be 5 things that you know you want to do. And depending how complex your system is, it could be 25 pages long, addressing every single portal or entryway of domestic and sexual violence response. And there's no wrong way to create this protocol. It's just important that you create one. Every protocol should have something about definition of domestic violence. And that sounds really basic, but it's actually not, because there's IPV, there's domestic violence, there's domestic abuse. Like if you Google it, you could come up with like 10 different ways people talk about this issue, and each of them means something different. So really figuring out together what you mean when you say IPV or domestic violence and sexual assault, or domestic violence as it addresses depression or mental health. Like, just get clear about what are you responding to, because your protocol will define, you want to define that. And then also, what are the guiding principles of your response, right? Again, it can be three things. For us, it's survivor-centered, anti-oppression, anti-racist, right? Those, if I had to quickly say, what are the guiding principles of domestic violence response for the coalition? That's what I would say. I'm sure my staff would add lots of other things, because we all have such passion for this work. But that really gives you a good starting place for all the rest of the protocol, because if you know what you're valuing and what principles are guiding your work and what you're responding to, the rest of the document writes itself. It's very easy. So the only other thing here, yes.
Vanessa,
hi, Narmala. Hi, Narmala.
Hi.
So good to hear your voice.
Can you just elaborate a little bit more for the audience on anti-oppressive practice and anti-racist practice? I know, we all kind of have heard about it, but some people may be a little less familiar. I don't know if you can maybe expound a little bit on it.
Oh, I'd be happy to. Thank you. It's a great question.
Thank
So, anti-oppression recognizes that oppression theory is the power over dynamic. And I'm just going to give a really brief, because I could talk all day about it, but I won't. And Carrie, please jump in with this, because I know this is work we've done together for many years. But anti-oppression practice is really recognizing that we don't want to use power over practices in our work. We don't want to set things up in a hierarchical power over way. And specifically, while we might have a hierarchy in terms of who decision making, we want to make sure we don't have a hierarchy around who is valued or how things are valued. So anti-oppression means to really look at those places where people are othered, where power is inequitably applied, and where people are disempowered or made invisible through the workplace or through our processes or our policies. So that is one of those really kind of broad way, because oppression can show up in a lot of different communities. It can be about how it can be applied to older advocates because of their age. It can be around disabilities. So it can be around age, disability, gender, gender expression, race, BIPOC for sure. It can be around language. It can be around mental health stuff. Like, oppression can show up in multiple ways. It could be urban versus rural, right? Or it can be around poverty and education. So we look at all of those ways that people are valued differently based on these kind of random assignments of value. And anti-racism is specifically about race. And it's specifically about how Black, Brown, Indigenous people are marginalized in a really or oppressed in a very specific way, where anti-oppression is about all those different communities I talked about. Anti-racism really looks at this specific category of oppression, which is race-based. And one of the best ways I think of dealing with all of that is really bringing in a liberation-based work environment that looks at equity and liberation throughout its system. And it's a big process. Carrie, what would you add to that?
I just think about, you know, a lot of the discussions we've also had. I know many of you are trauma informed and aware of trauma informed. We talked about this in webinar number 1 a bit, but also just the intersectionality of the folks that you're working with, the historical trauma that may have impacted communities, those layers of oppression. And so when you're working with folks in your clinics or you're working with domestic violence survivors, recognizing where the barriers come in based on the maybe which community they're part of, immigration status, things like that come to mind right away as an example, but not the only one by any means, and the impacts that that oppression has had on them. And I'm sure that all of you know that, but just how even the historical trauma will be underlying the current trauma they might be reaching out for support with.
And I think the biggest kind of the last thing I would say about that is when we're thinking about anti-oppression, anti-racism practices, like we want to both look outward, like what's happening in the communities that we're serving, but also look inward. How is our system perpetuating power over or racism, right? And so it's that process of looking both inward and outward that is important. And I think it's also important to really understand what the difference between equity and equality, and really think about that equality is that process of giving everyone the same thing. And it doesn't require a relationship or a conversation. It's like, I have 10 things, I'm going to give 10 people the same thing. Or it's that equity where you have to have a conversation and say, what do you need? What do you want? What does this mean to you to be in relationship with my organization? So really realizing that difference between equity and equality can go a long way in dismantling some of the oppressive or racist practices that we all have within our organizations. So
and I'll just put one other thing out. If you want to continue to have those conversations with your partners too, that your local domestic and sexual violence organizations have gone through our anti-oppression training. Some of them have gone through our anti-oppression train the trainers and participate in some of our work groups around continuing these conversations about equity and access. And so please, if you want to know more, we would love to talk to you more about it. We just can't go all the way in today.
Narmala, Narmala, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Thank you so much. And I love, Kerry, what you said, that the local DV partners could be a resource, because I would really encourage and I know some of our community mental health partners may already be on their paths towards, these incorporating these practices, and for others, it may be newer. So that's the value of having this partnership, because our DV partners are strong. They have strongly embedded this practice. So it could be a learning opportunity. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Narmala. Yeah, definitely reach out to us, and we are happy to bring trainings to you specifically, or share resources, or just have conversations about where you're struggling with it. So the other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of your protocols, and I don't know how many health folks, but this collection of evidence and photographs, and really having a deep dive conversation around how do you protect, or what is your protocol for survivor information, is what I would say about that. Just what does that protocol need to look like? You want to have a clear process for that, something you can actually share with survivors. Thank you, Carrie. I was already on that because I'm looking at my paper. Thank you. Okay, I just talked about that. Oh, plan for staff action, I think is important to kind of create that, put that into the protocol so that staff know and new employees know that domestic and sexual violence is part of the work that you do, and this is how they're going to be educated and supported in that. And I know that the coalition is currently upgrading our online training portal for domestic violence education. And so let us know if folks want to get in there and take the training. I mean, right now we're not signing folks up for it because we're in the process of redoing it, but soon it'll be redone, and that can be a resource for you all if you need it. Okay, Carrie, I think we have one more slide. Okay, so accessing domestic violence, and I think that this is, again, something that you can absolutely refer folks to your partners. If you're, this is something that you can do at a really basic level, or you can go deep in it depending on your role and what you're doing. But I wanted to share some questions that I know are very effective in doing assessment, so that you just didn't have to reinvent the wheel if you didn't want to. And the first one is, do you feel safe in your living environment? A lot of the assessment questions you find online, and some of the older ways we talked about this, will ask someone if they're being battered in their home, or if, and I think that it's important that we've learned as we've progressed as a field that survivors don't always know if they're being battered or not, or if it's violence or not. And so we go to that feeling. Do you feel safe? It allows for the conversation to be around safety, which we've already talked about centering, but it also allows for that complex, all those complexities around the pattern of domestic violence, which means it's emotional, spiritual, physical, sexual. There's all these ways that it shows up that aren't just physical. And so when we say battered, survivors often go to just the physical, and we'll just say, no, or feel like what's happening to them isn't violence because it was just a physical conversation. So do you feel safe in your living environment? Are you in a relationships in which you have been hurt? These are open questions that are just very, very effective. Do you feel isolated or controlled by your partner or a family member? Right? Is there a way that you're feeling isolated or controlled? Are you in a relationship in which you are often put down, belittled, or insulted? So these are some assessment questions that are going to give you information about how to make a referral, how to safety plan, how to have your addictions conversation around sobriety. I think it's really important to have these conversations when someone's new in their sobriety process, and able to kind of identify some of the areas that might lead to relapse or make sobriety challenging. So these are some good assessment questions. Carrie, would you add anything here?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, these are, yeah.
Great. Yeah, these are some of the ones, I mean, there you can find assessment questions, pages and pages, but I picked the ones that have been most effective and that I hear from the folks that I've trained have been the most useful for them. So I share those with you.
I think the only thing, Vanessa, as you were talking, and I believe you got to this, but I'm just going to underline it again for folks on the call, is recognizing one of the reasons we don't say battered anymore is also because the emotional abuse, the verbal abuse, is the behavior that makes somebody feel like they're being gaslit, like they feel like they're going crazy. They say it. And it's so, I've worked with survivors who said, I wish you would just hit me. Then I would know what's happening. I don't know what's happening.
Yes.
And so it's really important to go through these that way, because there may not be physical violence. There may be, at least there may not be punching or hitting. There may be breaking something or threats of violence. So
yeah. And thank you, Carrie. And your partners, your advocate partners are so skilled at risk assessment and assessment. So write them into your protocols. I think they can be a great resource for you.
You ready for the next slide, Vanessa?
Yes. Yeah, I think that, so when we're looking at assessing for domestic violence, now we're going to talk about assessing risk. And so, you've identified that there's violence, and now you're going to want to identify what kind of violence and what kinds of risks are you dealing with. Oh, okay, great. Thank you, Carrie. So the first question is, what risk are you concerned with, right? Ask the survivor, ask the person in front of you, what are you most concerned about, right? That question is key because the survivor knows better than anybody what risks are present in their relationship, in their community, in their workplace. Like, they're going to know where those risks are. So that basic question, what risks are you concerned with? If you just ask that, I think it's going to take you a long way. Is your partner sharing your living environment? So this is really getting at, are you living with your perpetrator, right? Or are they likely to return? And this is often helpful for kind of that initial safety plan. I'll give you just a quick example of this. You're working in an addictions clinic. You're talking with a survivor about a sobriety plan. They bring up domestic and sexual violence. This question allows you to say, are you going home? When you go home, is the perpetrator, the person causing harm, going to be at your house, or are they likely to show up in the next couple of days? If the answers are yes, then you're going to want a safety plan, because the conversation you've had with the survivor has got them thinking already and changing something. And so you want to really support them in preparing for what comes next. And they're going to know that. It's just going to be a conversation. And then, of course, do you feel an immediate danger? Do they think that the person causing harm is going to be the cause of that danger? Have there been any threats? And do they have weapons? This question used to be, do they have a gun? And we've changed that. This shows that evolution of the practice. It's not just that we've heard from survivors that it's not just about guns, right? That it can be any kind of weapon that can be a threat. So this is just a brief conversation about assessing risk. If you want, one of the things that Narmala and Carrie and I just recently decided is that we're going to be doing a 4th webinar in a couple of, probably a month or so out, as you've had a chance to practice a while. Some of these risks and risk assessment, DV assessment, you'll hopefully have written some of your protocols, and more questions are going to emerge from that process of just doing the work. And then you're going to have we'll have an opportunity to get your frequently asked questions, and then to do a nice deep dive into what's showing up as you've been doing the work. And know that we can talk at that time more deeply about risk assessment, because I know that we're just touching a very, very brief, surface view of this topic, and it can be a much deeper topic. Carrie, any adding? Okay, next slide.
Okay.
So Carrie and I are both going to chat with you about the toolkit. It is one of your other handouts, right, Carrie? We got that.
The electric version today.
Yes. And I think I just wanted to go over, or we want to go over what's in the toolkit. I think I'll let Carrie do that. I'll talk to you about how and why the toolkit was developed. The toolkit was created, it was one of the first things that I did as an executive director at the coalition. So this was a while ago. And it was created by a team of mental health professionals, psychiatrists, therapists, massage therapists, addictions counselors, and folks in the movement industry, like chiropractors, folks like that. So we had quite a nice team. And we really, the challenge they brought to us as a coalition was, we need something that is sitting on our desk, laying on the massage table, sitting, something really small that we can flip through and get quick answers to some of the most critical questions that we're faced with as practitioners. So this is what we created. It has been sent all over the country. Folks seem to really like it. It was recently updated a little bit, and I hope it's a good resource for you. But that's how it was created and why it was created. Carrie, do you want to go over the?
Yeah. So I'm just going to show you, if you all can see me. It's about this size, just exactly what Vanessa said, very small. You are going to also get these in the mail. You'll each clinic site will get about 50. So we'll be mailing them to you. So the introductions, just kind of explains it a little bit and what the background is and some of the statistics. And you all have gotten that. It talks about the types of abuse. It's really easy. It's color coded. So you can kind of, as you're talking with somebody on the phone or telehealth visit, maybe instead of having it up here, you're going to have it below and you can be talking to them. And, it talks about emotional abuse. It gives some examples of what emotional abuse is, talks about sexual abuse, and how that's one of the most common forms. And it gives some examples of the range of sexual abuse, from rape to criticizing someone's sexuality to, uncomfortable or unwanted touch. It talks about social abuse, about some of those things. We talk about isolation and or insisting to spend all their time together, restricting use of cars, or other things like that, or transportation. It talks about financial abuse, and it really goes into a variety of examples of financial abuse. Again, just really easy as you're talking to somebody, you can start to do and look through these indicators, emotional indicators, behavioral indicators, and physical indicators, which I know during this time, you may not be in person, you may be more virtual with telehealth, but it will give you some ideas of discussions or what to listen to. Maybe they're talking about something that's happened to them. And then it has a screening and risk assessment as a part of the book. So some of those questions that Vanessa has already gone over, it has just a few of those easy questions to talk to them about. And then how to support them and how to do some basic safety planning. And of course, connecting to the local program, which is this whole project, why we're so excited to do this, was really how do we further develop the relationships and collaborations within communities that build stronger safety nets for survivors of domestic and sexual violence and stalking. And so we appreciate this time with all of you.
Absolutely. So that is what I have to share. If you have any questions about, clinical practice and creating your protocols or using the toolkit, you can send me questions after the webinar to, send them to Rowan, and Rowan will connect to me and we'll get the answers to you. But hopefully this has been a good start. So Carrie, do you want to go on with the next pieces?
Sure, I can go ahead and do that. We're going to start talking about survivors' needs. I know we have about another hour together. We're not right at 2 o'clock, but do people want to go ahead and take 5 minutes to stand and move around? How about we go ahead and give 3 minutes to stand, move around, get another glass of water, or a cup of coffee, something that you need.
Yeah, good break time.
Let's go ahead and do a good break time before we dive into some survivors' needs and the rest. Yeah. I'm going to go to the next slide just to hold space because it just gives you it gives you another website, but we already went through all of this. So go ahead, take a few minutes. It is 1:50 and we will come back at 1:55.
Okay, thanks,
Is that
Carrie.
too long?
No, I was actually thinking we were going to that's 5 minutes. That's perfect.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Hey, I am
We have
back.
about 1 minute, everybody.
We both got back at the same time, Carrie.
Yeah, I did the quick run to make sure the 14-year-old was eating lunch, which he was not. So, yep, it's still snowing here.
Yeah,
So,
I've got
everybody else in
flakes coming down. It hasn't stopped all day.
Mm-mm.
Gonna be a snowy weekend, everyone.
Yeah, my kids were already out and sledding before, just on the sidewalk, but before school started this morning.
Yeah.
Okay. Almost. Just a few more minutes. I'll make sure everybody has that time to stretch and move. And we all sit so much in front of our computers during this time. It can be really challenging, I know. Okay. Yep, we're gonna get going. It's 1:55. So we're gonna switch from talking about screening from domestic violence, or screening for, not from, sorry, another snowy day in Eastern Oregon. That's awesome. I'm in Portland. We hadn't had any snow in the valley here yet, but I gotta tell you, I was actually ready for it. So it makes things nice and cozy. So pretty. So thanks everybody. I hope you're back with your water, your coffee or tea, whatever it is that you needed to get so you can take care of yourselves. We're going to shift from screening and risk assessment to talking about survivors' needs. And we're going to focus, there's many needs, of course, right? But we're really going to focus on housing. We're going to talk about safety. We're going to talk about the legal help that's out there and what are the different options. We're going to talk about parenting, and we're going to talk about healthcare. So I think it's important to do that. Again, feel free to type questions into the chat box, or you can always, if you know how to use your hand up emoji, you can also use your hand up if you want to take yourself off put your camera on. But we're really going to shift now. So here we go. We're going to talk more about survivors' needs. So talking about housing, I think this is something that's we're pretty aware of in Oregon. We know that housing and the economic impacts of domestic violence, that really what happens often is the two most pressing concerns for survivors of abuse are that the need for safe housing and the need for economic resources to maintain that safety. These are some interesting percentages. I'm just kind of showing you the issues. About 80% of homeless women experience DV, or they had previously experienced domestic violence. We know that is one of the #1 driving factors for domestic violence or for homelessness for women and children. And 57% of homelessness was actually directly caused by that. So showing that homeless women report domestic violence is the immediate cause of their homelessness. And so I think that's important to note. Safe Housing Partnerships is an excellent resource. That's where that study came from. We know that in Oregon, we have challenges because we know that in our urban areas, there's not enough housing, but it's more about affordable housing. In many of our rural and frontier areas, there's the actual lack of physical housing as well. So this is a little bit about barriers to safety and understanding the intersection. So, if there's some unique barriers that survivors often face when they're trying to access shelter and affordable housing. There is poor credit and ruined rental histories. Sometimes abusers have ruined the credit as part of that financial abuse. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, how common that is. Also that they may have lied about paying the rent. And so maybe there is a poor rental history. Paying rent, utilities, childcare, other bills. And it definitely affects a survivor's ability to pass a landlord background check. So those can be really very real ways that even after they have left the relationship, that the credit's been ruined, the rental history has been ruined. Housing discrimination can happen when maybe a landlord has evicted the entire family due to violence and destruction and repeated calls to the police and maybe damaged property. That's a part of the domestic violence that's happening. So that can make it really challenging for them to get another place or to have a safe place for themselves and their children. The loss of subsidized or other affordable housing. So maybe there's a lease or a voucher policy violation that was committed by the abuser, and that impacts the entire family. So that's something to be aware of. Also, lack of steady employment really plays into this housing piece. And you might ask how, but if a survivor is forced to miss work due to, as a result of violence, they either physically cannot get there or they're being stalked or harassed at the workplace by their abuser, they may lose their employment or then not able to keep steady employment. And so that, of course, will impact their ability to pay for a steady home or housing for themselves and their children. And we really want to make sure that we notice that this is particularly true for survivors of many marginalized and historically marginalized communities in our society that have the least access to resources: survivors of colors, Indigenous survivors, immigrants, living in poverty, and in those geographical locations where there's a lot of isolation in the rural communities. We know this happens also, and disabilities, folks with disabilities. So the long-term and short-term impacts of the financial abuse can be really devastating. We know that financial abuse occurs in 99% of domestic violence cases.
Carrie,
Before
we leave from the housing piece, I wanted to make a note that for folks to just be aware that there's a lot of rental protections that are specific to COVID that you'll want to kind of be aware of as you're doing this work. And also that the Oregon Law Center has a tremendous amount of supports for protecting survivors from eviction and some of the laws that were put into place around Oregon specific to that. So those are some resources. And I know that the Count Her In report that was done several years ago has a nice deep dive that can be helpful for you around housing stuff and domestic and sexual violence. So I just wanted to mention those few housing parts.
Thanks. Thanks, Vanessa. The Count Her In report, Leah or Rowan, if either of you could look that up and put the link in the chat box, I think that'd be great. I'll also make sure to put it in the notes, and that's very Oregon specific. Okay, anything else, Vanessa?
No, that's just kind of, I think you talked about the specific things for marginalized folks. Yeah. I think the only thing I would add to that is that BIPOC folks have higher incidents of incarceration proportionally in Oregon, and that directly affects housing in a specific way for BIPOC survivors. So I would add that, and it's like everything, always be considering marginalized, anti-racism, anti-oppression, and always consider those in survivor needs. Yes.
Oh, I'm just going to answer a question that Rowan typed in the chat. For me and Rowan, that would be the Count Us In study.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so when we're talking about housing, and that was a question that came up from you all, I wanted to make sure that we also considered the financial needs because financial abuse occurs in 99% of domestic violence cases. And it's the main reason that victims cite that they stayed or returned to an abuse of a partner. And the short-term and long-term effects of financial abuse can be devastating, right? And in the short term, it's access to assets, which are imperative to staying safe. So access to a home, to a car, to a bank account. It's also, without those assets, survivors are unable to obtain safe and affordable housing, or the funds to provide for themselves and their children. And so we know that housing is a big part of families getting stable and staying safe after they've left a domestic violence relationship. And so the realistic fears of being homeless are really what contributes sometimes to that return to an abusive partner. Okay. We're going to talk about survivors' needs and safety. And I know we've talked a lot about safety planning, and you know, this is just one of those wonderful word bubbles. And how do you think about their needs around safety? And we did a lot around this already, so I'm not going to talk about this part too much, but I'm going to give you the text safety. Aaron, thank you for your chat. Local domestic violence advocates have experience with no resources and can support survivors with housing barriers. That is really important to know. And thank you, Aaron, for saying that. Aaron's with Tides of Change. So many of our organizations that are part of this project and or a emergency domestic violence shelter. And those look different around the state. Some of them are group living situations. Some of them have some more kind of private areas. Clackamas Women's Services, I know, redid their shelter a few years ago. I know Tides of Change has a shelter that they did. Oh gosh, I'm going to say almost a decade, but let me know, Aaron, if I'm wrong. And so and they also have access to knowing how to get folks into safe housing, emergency hotel vouchers, which are part of this project. So that's also important to know, is that each of the 7 domestic and sexual violence organizations participating have $5,000 of emergency housing vouchers that are dollars that can go towards emergency housing. And that sounds like a lot, but it goes really fast, especially during this COVID time. And that can look like a hotel, a motel. It can look like supporting them in I know some of our tribal nations are very creative during warmer times of the year, but with campsites, and paying for campsites. And so anyhow, the point that Aaron made about domestic violence advocates and those community-based programs are really, really well versed in the housing that's available and how to access housing, the whole range. And some have transitional housing programs, and some are focused on finding that permanent housing as well. Okay. All right. So safety planning. So we talked a lot about this, how, you know, prioritizing what are their current safety needs, really building this with the survivor. And domestic violence advocates will do that. And then they will also build it with the survivor. They'll update it. They'll build it before they leave. They'll build it after, a new one after they leave, because things change. We know that the most dangerous time for a survivor is actually when they've left that violent relationship, because that power and control has been broken, and the abuser will do anything to regain that control. And that's when we see the most homicides happen. So it is in the stalking that ends up happening afterwards. So it is important to do it before and after they've left as well.
And
Vanessa?
Carrie, yeah, one thing I want to add around safety planning is to include resiliency efforts in the safety planning process, including where is the survivor strong, where is the survivor well-resourced, yes. Where is the survivor skilled, what are their specific skills for keeping themselves safe, and identifying how they've kept themselves safe in the past and what's worked. That resiliency piece kind of links back to what I was talking about integrating DV into your practice. And the other thing I wanted to say about safety is to look at community risk, specifically when you're working in BIPOC communities or other marginalized communities, because community can be a really complicated space for BIPOC, queer, and other marginalized folks. And so it does pose risks that we don't think about if we're coming from a dominant culture framework.
Yes, yes. So talking to them about who is safe, who is their community, where are their support systems?
Yeah.
Maybe if it's not safe, where can they, or maybe they've been moved from their community.
Right.
Or there's going to be a loss of community by leaving
Yes,
this relationship.
absolutely. Just
Planning
what are
around
the
it.
specific risks that are community centered? What are your specific community centered risks, and what safety protocols need to be put in place for those?
Mhm. So talking also then about like possible technology and what could be used. Talking about what types of things have happened to make them feel unsafe or cause concern. And then there's another link here about tech safety and resources, and actually has some great resources around safety planning, specifically around technology. And I'm going to go into that a little bit. Okay. So technology safety plan. There's a few questions you can ask. You can ask them if they're concerned about the abuser knowing where they are all the time. It's during COVID right now, but if they're out and they're going to work or they're running errands and folks are just showing up, and that might be a little more, it might be different when we're not on lockdown. But we are using technology so much right now. So are they worried that their abuser might be able to access their communication with other people? I think is a really important question for right now. With telehealth, you're doing things on the phone, you're doing things on the computer. Are they concerned that there might be extra applications on the phone? Do they know how to erase their history on their computer? Just really thinking about those and just asking. Are they concerned about information that's being posted about them online? That is a common technique that abusers will do. They'll use a social media site. They'll make a new social media site with their name. They might already have their passwords to what social media they use and put disparaging information or information out there that is not correct or could be traumatic. Are they concerned about other ways that information might be shared about them online? So talking about how do they search for themselves and search for information that may be out there. And I'm sure many of you have seen some pretty public media cases around that. Other things to be considering during this time around technology and safety is you can talk to them about, are they concerned about their children or friends or family use of technology, if that could compromise their safety. I'm thinking, there's kiddos and they're on a variety of sites at this point. And so maybe if they've left their abuser, but their kiddo still has like tags that they've checked in someplace, or is doing some fun, normal social media activity, and that can like give away where they're at. That's something to think about. Or maybe they're staying with they're asking not to be even on. That's why we let you all know we're recording, right? So we also do that let folks know if it's okay to take pictures or not. That's why so many of our schools have very, very strict rules around children and being on the internet too. You can ask them if they're concerned about their ability to continue using technology while maintaining safety and privacy. There might be some creative answers that your local domestic violence advocates, you can work with them around accessing new technology, around, how can they maybe get some different types of technology. I mean, one of the biggest things we don't want to do is ever take away someone's cell phone. At this point, like a cell phone is really like a lifeline for many folks, and they can call 911, et cetera, but they're also little computers and they can be used to track. They can locate the devices. They can be compromised with apps. And so it's technology can be amazing and life-saving, and can also, it's just something to be considered when you're building a safety plan or talking to a survivor about how maybe that some of the abuse might be happening for them, or the control, and concerns about your privacy and safety, just asking them around those. Again, your local domestic violence advocates have gone through a lot of the safety net training, and then the National Network to End Domestic Violence has a special safety net project. So you can always reach out to your local programs and they can tap that or tap us and ask us if we have specific hypotheticals about how someone's being stalked, or maybe how to safety plan around that. Okay, any questions around safety planning or technology? All right, you can type in the chat box or unmute. Otherwise, I'm going to move on. If it does jog something for you, please let me know. So we're just going to talk a little bit about survivors' needs. I am going to let you all know I am not a lawyer. I'm just going to say it right away. So I'm going to really talk about this as what we see as advocates that survivors need. And I'm going to call out some pretty basic things that you all probably are aware of, but there's the criminal and then there's the civil legal, right? And our survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault have avenues in both. So here is the Oregon statute, and that goes into the details of the legal definition in Oregon. And I'm going to let y'all look up that and look at it as you'd like. It talks about intimate partners. It talks about living in Oregon. We do have a broad definition where they, which is great. They also talk about family members. So you're under the same roof with other family members. It can fall into that. So I do think it's important to look. It's important to recognize that a criminal case is about breaking a law. So domestic violence is illegal. But what that means is then that survivor may or may not be consulted in whether or not they want to have their abuser go to court, be held accountable in that system. And so once that report's made or once law enforcement is involved, that is really not the decision of the survivors anymore. We really talk with a lot of district attorneys, and our movement's done trainings for years, and DAs know that the best practice is to make sure that they're talking to survivors so they can keep them centered and safety, but they're going to decide to move forward if they have enough evidence, or if they don't have enough evidence, they may not move forward. Also, if a survivor does want them to move forward, it can be really challenging because it's now a crime against the state. It's not about that individual anymore when you get to the criminal justice system. So the DA and the law enforcement gives the resources to the DA, and they're really the ones who determine if they're going to go forward with it. And one thing to note, DAs have victim assistance providers, or DAVAPs, because we love our acronyms. And they're there to work with victims as they're working with the district attorney and having that criminal justice case. And those are not confidential. The DAVAPs are not confidential. They're a wealth of information. They have wonderful training, most of them. And but they're really there to be that warm person to let a victim know what's happening in the course, what the DA may do or may not do when court is happening. And it's not confidential. And I just really want to underline that. Our domestic and sexual violence advocates also can be there and be a support, and they are confidential. So it's a really different. I'm going to go ahead. Rowan put a correct link in, and Emily asked, are there major differences in practice between Oregon counties and how law enforcement responds to criminal cases? Ooh, Vanessa, you want to help me with that one?
Absolutely. So can you read the question again?
My short answer is yes, but are there major differences in practice between Oregon counties and how law enforcement responds to criminal cases?
Yes, definitely. That would be my answer too. I think that the specifics of that are more challenging to get to. I think it's a great question to discuss with your community partners, because each of your partners are in the communities that you're in. And so you're going to see both changes, kind of different rules and different, but more than that, you're going to see different practices. The law is nuanced and it's all about interpretation. So while you're not going to see wide, flailing differences in the laws across the state, you are going to see a lot of difference in practice and interpretation, and then you're going to see differences in local rules. For example, if there is a law around mandatory arrest, or you might see in some communities where that's practice, where they show up and both people are arrested right away. And that's just their practice. In other places, an advocate might be accompanying the officers and they're having a more nuanced response. So it's those practices that you're going to see vary widely across the state, while you're not going to see a law vary that widely. So that's my quick answer. Carrie, what would you add to that?
I would just add, for example, Emily, you're in Clackamas County. So Clackamas Women's Services, Washington County, and Multnomah County have family justice centers. So their relationships and the domestic violence programs have a formal relationship with a lot of law enforcement in that way. However, some of the other communities also just how well their law enforcement is paid and staffed, and have had struggles even with being able to pay.
Mhm.
And then also, who they police and how they're policing also really impacts specifically communities of color in a very different way as well. So it's a great question. But yeah, working collaboratively, some of your your domestic and sexual violence programs will be on teams that are looking at a coordinated community response. That's been a big piece of our movement for quite some time. They'll be on family, on domestic violence fatality review teams possibly, or a sexual assault response team where they're getting together with other folks to really talk about response and how it goes, how it can be better. And then they are supposed to get domestic violence training as well. But whether or not they're getting that at the in-depthness, I never think everybody gets enough training.
Yeah,
So,
I agree.
Yeah. And then Tara wrote in the chat, just so you see, the barriers to focus on specific crimes is challenging when there's no specialized law enforcement to focus on domestic violence and sexual violence crimes.
Absolutely.
And they investigate all. And we do know our urban areas have that ability. They do have a divert team, or
Multnomah County specifically has had divert for a long time, and they've had a domestic violence unit within law enforcement, and which is amazing. And then in Ashland, you have one of the premier law enforcement responses to sexual assault in the country, in Ashland, Oregon. So it's broad. And but I will just re-emphasize to chat with your community partners about that specific thing, because I think it's really important to just review the response and talk about it. Because I think when you're dealing with mental health, suicide, addiction, domestic violence, sexual violence, law enforcement and those relationships we have with them are incredibly important, and we want to cultivate those in a really good way. And so we need to know what our role is not lawyers or law enforcement, but we need to know enough to inform their practice.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And then just one other final piece to underscore the difference between a DA, VAP, or a victims assistance provider and the domestic violence advocate is a domestic violence advocate will walk with them even after the criminal case is over, or if they said, no, I'm from one of these communities, I do not feel safe going to law enforcement. They might be an immigrant, or they might be, something else, and they have very real concerns about being deported. So there might be some very valid concerns why they would not call law enforcement, or maybe law enforcement wasn't able to show up. Some of our communities, it's very resource driven. Do they have the resources? Are they going to call 911 and someone shows up 15 minutes, an hour, 2 hours later? So it can be really challenging in some of the more rural and frontier areas of the state with response. But the big piece is that confidentiality that we did such a deep dive in on webinar 2, and that domestic violence advocates will be there with them through a criminal case, or if they decide not to go through that, no matter what, they'll still be there to do safety planning, supports, helping with housing, helping with the whole bigger picture too. And then I'm going to talk about civil legal, which is a big piece that we work really closely with the Oregon Law Center, and we work really closely with a variety of other I have them on the next slide and my brain just blinked. So I will get to them when I get there. But civil legal, really looking at a variety of ways that survivors' needs are in the civil legal realm. So, depending on state laws and rules, there may be some protections for survivors. And Vanessa was talking about that. We have some really great protections in housing law for survivors. So when our domestic and sexual violence advocates are talking with folks, they're talking about maybe some immigration law that might be there, housing law, family law is big. That's the one that we all jump right to, if they're going to get a divorce, if there's children in custody in there, that can be, that's a big tangled, challenging part, especially if there's domestic violence and abuse, even if not. Employment law, there is specific employment law around domestic violence and protections. And then a big category is what I talk about is orders of protection. So we have five types in Oregon. We have one that is very specific to intimate partner violence and domestic violence. It's called the FAPA, Family, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone on the call, Family Abuse Protection. I don't know what the second A is.
Carrie, what I was thinking we might do is send out the comparison chart so we don't have to go through all of them, because those acronyms will make anyone, they're complicated and it's recording and there's no way we're going to get them all right.
Got it. I will send out the chart. Thank you. I should have plugged it in there. But we have a chart that compares them. And so you can know, and they're also commonly called restraining orders. Yeah. So that you know that is one thing, thanks, Aaron. That is one thing, but there's specific ones for domestic violence. There's a specific one for elder abuse. There's a specific one for sexual assault. And there's an emergency one. And so we'll get those out to you.
Yeah, there's a lot. We'll get them out.
Yeah. And then, so it is important though, as you look at these, our domestic violence advocates think through all the pros and cons of disclosing abuse to employers or public benefits or housing because of that discrimination that survivors may face. And we talked a little bit about that in the housing. So these are some legal resources I think that are important and wonderful to know. The Battered Women's Justice Project does a lot of creation of resources, and they don't do any direct representation, but they are a great wealth of information. Womenslaw.org is really has a lot of handy things that you can even pull down for a survivor and walk through it with them, or refer a survivor to womenslaw.org. It's very much focused on being accessible. Here in Oregon, we have some wonderful folks that we work with. So the big one is the Oregon Law Center, and they also do the legal aid services. And if you go to their link that I have there, you can find some of these comparison charts. You can find a lot of details about where their services are, what their services are, and how survivors can get support. Victim Rights Law Center is that next one, and they have a Boston office and a Portland office. They also do some representation. They focus on sexual assault, but also intimate partner sexual assault. So that is one thing to be aware of, and they do some wonderful training. We have them and the Oregon Law Center do training for us a few times a year, every year, for our domestic and sexual violence advocates. And then NCVLI is the National Crime Victims Law Institute. It's out of Lewis and Clark, but they also do a lot of legal training, a legal representation around the state. They have a specific grant right now to do that as well. And then specifically, I realized I did not put this in a link, and I should have. I know that the RLC has some Spanish-speaking lawyers as well, and Oregon Law Center. Also, Catholic Charities will do some around immigration law and specifically new visas as they interact for domestic violence victims with the Violence Against Women Act. So, and that's important to note that they provide those services. Okay. All right, we're going to start talking about parenting. 2:30, I'm just doing a little bit of a chime check on survivors' needs and parenting and how domestic violence can impact parenting. Did anybody have questions before I shifted? Okay. All right. We don't want to run out of time, but I also want to make sure that you're getting your time to ask. So living with violence can affect a woman's parenting in both indirect and direct ways. This research, this is a quote, you can see it here. So that's, I'm just staying directly with the quote. We do know that men are also victims of domestic violence. And we know though that a lot of the research has been done around, there's the numbers still, a greater proportion are of women that are impacted by domestic violence. Some researchers have found that women who are victims, oh, that didn't read right, parent as effectively as their non-abused counterparts, in spite of the obstacles they face. And that might be surprising to some of you, but it is important to know that. And there are obstacles, and so we will talk about those obstacles. And they might come up as you're doing, suicide prevention or in your counseling sessions with them. It's important to recognize that the domestic violence can really erode a way that someone can parent in a variety of ways. They may not have been able to focus on safety, or they may only focus on safety, survival, and meeting the abuser's needs rather than nurturing the children. And that's a safety mechanism. It's important to know that there may be some mental health, drug or alcohol abuse, or poor physical health triggered by the abuse. I'm sure that doesn't come up as surprising to you, but that a coping mechanism can be alcohol. Her functioning as a parent could be undermined by the abuser's interference, by impact of his degrading behavior, or resulting in the erosion of her authority with the children. Many folks are either not allowed to be the disciplinarian, or have very specific rules of about what that may look like. The stress from the domestic violence may result in neglect or maltreatment. That just overwhelming stress and anxiety, that trauma has impacted them. They may not be able to care for their children in certain ways. The shame and the guilt is probably what you'll hear a lot about. The shame and the guilt about the abuse, and how it may have inhibited her communication with her children. The shame and the guilt, and is she able to protect her children? Was she able to protect her children from the abuse? Was there certain things that were done? And then a abuser's dominance may prevent a parent from parenting as they choose, or negotiating parenting together as a couple, whereas in a healthy relationship, that parenting may be more of a joint role and discussion about how do we parent, and how do we take turns, and how do we support one another. Some needs that you may want here come up as you're talking with folks, things to be really aware of, that they have shared parenting with an abusive partner. That can be really complicated, even if they're already split. Just seeking that understanding with them about what that may look like, what challenges may have come up for that. And the survivor's need around is helping her identify and connect with social supports. So how they're going to get supported specifically around parenting, or maybe new ways of parenting they want to do, or where they want to revisit some of that. It's important to recognize that there's some domestic violence abusers actually get custody, and there may be supervised visitation with the abusive parent, or there may be unsupervised visitation. And those are things that domestic violence advocates are going to assist navigate and safety plan around visitations with the abusive parent, or the unsafe parent. And if it's supervised visitation, sometimes even who's supervising it. Is it a family member that may not be safe for the survivor? So there's going to be a lot of safety planning that goes into what types of visitations are done with that other parent. And there's a very real fear, and often it's been used as a threat, that the partner will kidnap the children. Another piece will be child support payments. A lot of, in Oregon, it's mandatory that the non-custodial parent will have child support. We did a big piece with the child support folks over at Department of Justice, at the Oregon Department of Justice, around domestic violence and screening and training for those folks, because a lot of times a survivor will be like, I don't want him to pay child support. I don't want them to pay child support because it'll trigger something. It'll make them angry. It will make them want to come after me again. Please don't make them pay child support. And it's important to recognize that where that fits in as a safety factor, even though it might look really, they have a right to that, and that it would help ease some of the financial burden, just knowing that that stress could be there too, that it could escalate violence. Okay. I think we're doing good on time. Any questions around survivors' needs in parenting? Many of our domestic and sexual violence organizations, so you're aware, have either children's advocates or specific mental health supports for children or for parenting, pregnant and parenting folks as well. Okay. Okay, survivors' needs and health. So in addition to immediate harm caused by the that may happen due to the physical injury, ongoing violence and trauma contributes to health effects, a lifetime of health effect over the course of a survivor's life. And I'm sure that does not come as a surprise to many of you. This comes directly from some of the work that we've done previously that Vanessa mentioned before. So some of these stats are actually in I didn't put that link, actually the document there, but if you do want to look at our healthcare manual, IPV and healthcare manual that the coalition created, I can send that to you. Vanessa, you're unmuted. Did you want to speak?
Yeah, I was actually just going to recommend that folks grab that and take a look at it while they're doing their protocols. It's got some really good information around how domestic violence advocates and shelter advocates, shelters specifically, which is something we haven't talked a whole lot about, and healthcare settings can work together.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And some of the folks that are a part of this project actually were a part of our Safer Futures project, so they have relationships with the healthcare partners as well. So I know, at least on today's meeting, I'm looking, I know Haven from Violence in the Dells. I know Tides of Change in Tillamook has done this work that are on the call today. So there is a wealth of information with your local partners that have done this healthcare work and continue to do so. But we know that women who have experienced domestic violence are 80% more likely to have a stroke. They're 70% more likely to have heart disease, 60% more likely to have asthma, and 70% more likely to drink heavily than women who have not experienced domestic violence. And that's a CDC study.
And Carrie, I think that one of the things that was really striking for me when I saw this, when I was working on the other project, was how closely these statistics match with the ACE scores from the Kaiser Permanente study. I know that folks on this webinar have probably seen that. I just think that's interesting that we're looking at really similar numbers when we look at those two specific sets of data.
Yeah, and we definitely didn't have time to do it today, but we have that manual that Vanessa and I were talking about talks about the correlation with the ACEs study and how the social determinants of health, and really doing a deep dive into how does intimate partner violence, domestic violence really, why it's so important to pay attention to in screening and how it impacts health and mental health. Which is you all are familiar with. So one of the things that when we're talking, our domestic and sexual violence advocates are talking with survivors, we're talking to them about the impact on the health we just saw their stats there. There's other impacts that may happen as well, impacts on pregnancy if they're currently pregnant, whether or not, and then we also do trainings on reproductive and sexual coercion. So are they able to control their birth control? Are they allowed to have birth control? Are they able to control whether or not they have children? Oh, Rowan put a link to the ACEs study. Thank you. And what the impacts also might be on pregnancy of violence with this stress. Also we know oftentimes violence will increase during pregnancy. I'm not sure if I'm saying that the correct way, Vanessa, if that makes sense, but if you want to correct me, go for it.
No, I'm sorry, Carrie. What was your question? About
I was saying that we know that during pregnancy, domestic violence will increase.
Yes. Yeah, that there, that it's a risk factor for physical violence. And so that is one of the specific, that's a specific data set that you'll find in some of the research, is that pregnancy can be increase the risk of physical violence in a domestic violence relationship. That's the actual data that we're citing.
Yeah. So we've done a lot of training around the state and we do a lot of work with, we've done training for doulas and midwives and work collaboratively with them, and also some of those other traditional healthcare workers and community health workers or others. And then also the reproductive and sexual coercion. We've done a lot of discussions around, both, access to birth control. We've done some pretty specific projects with Planned Parenthood, as well as the community-based clinics, and I just forgot the name of them. But yeah, it's been some really exciting partnerships, and we can always talk more about that. But it is something to think about and listen when you're working with survivors. Are they able to control whether or not they have access to birth control, whether or not they get pregnant, whether or not they get to keep their pregnancy? That's also another piece that we hear. And it's something to listen and talk about with, and notice how that impacts their health.
Yeah, and let us know if y'all need a specific training on reproductive and sexual coercion. It is a different body of work, and so it does require specific training around how to do risk assessment, how to do safety planning, how to, all of that is nuanced and changed when we're looking at that specific issue.
Thanks, Tara.
Tara's on here. Thanks.
Yeah, Tara's on, and she's one of the programs that did some of this work with us with Project Connect and also with Safer Futures. And she put public health and FQHC, federally qualified health centers. So
Thank you, Tara.
Yeah. Again, why I'm so excited about this project, because you're partnering with some amazing domestic and sexual violence organizations that are already doing a lot around healthcare and survivors' needs and how to really work together and have quite a breadth of experience with that. But really, also some of the other pieces around this are survivors. Have they been able to access healthcare? Have they not been allowed to access healthcare? These are some of the things that may come up as they're talking with you. And what type of healthcare, or is it that their abuser is always with them in the emergency room and controlling the conversation, or with them for their visits with their doctors or their nurse practitioners or their midwives? Is there some time that individual gets to speak one-on-one with a doctor so that they can actually assess what's happening? So, okay. Any questions on that or ideas?
I just have a comment on what you said, that if any of our mental health partners would like, this is Nirmala, would like any more information on this last slide, on impacts on health, pregnancy, and sexual coercion, because it's not very frequently not very common in our work. If you think that would be useful, please let us know, and then we can work with CADSVA to see whether we can provide you with additional information or even a short webinar, which we are planning to give one in a month
Yes.
or two.
Yes.
So please let us know.
Thanks, Nirmala.
Okay. All right. All right. That is actually, we ended a little early. I want to make sure to give you all some time to ask questions. But before
That's
I do that, I'm
crazy,
going to say
Karen.
this is, pardon?
That's so funny. We were speed training and we actually ended up with more time. Yes.
Oops, I went the wrong way. So I want to make sure that you have the PSU evaluation link. Thank you, Rowan popped it into the chat box too. Please remember, PSU is doing this is an evaluation of our training. It also helps Vanessa and I as we build further trainings in the future, what we can do better, what more information you might want to get. The cool thing is after every training, for those who fill out the evaluations, PSU pulls from the names and will send you a $50 gift certificate to Amazon. If you watch the past recordings and then fill out the evaluations once a month for the duration of the project, they'll then go back and see who all has filled out the evaluation, even from the previously recorded webinars. And you'll go into a drawing for a $50 Amazon gift certificate as well. And so that's a really kind of fun thing. Emily, I will send out the recordings to the listserv again. I want to say thank you to Eliza at PSU who set up our listserv. And I think it's really I'll make sure to get that out to you all so you can review those. Our website's being updated and we'll also hope to have them there. And then I know Nirmala is going to actually have them as well, or has the 2 recordings as well. Let's see, Brianna had a question. Let's see here, Vanessa, especially considering this is the world of telehealthcare, are there any tools professionals can use to identify whether an abuser is present in the room, monitoring, etc.? How can professionals work to create one-on-one time with their survivor?
Wow, thank you for that question. I've actually been working with my advisory team on this specific question, and we are going to come out with some ideas. And as you know, we don't know what's going to work, right? This is all new to everyone to have this level of in-home communication. I was just talking with visiting nurses, and we're all struggling with this. What's emerged so far, and I just offer this as, I just had this conversation yesterday, and so it's not practiced yet. But what's emerged so far is to use text messaging directly with the survivor if you know domestic violence is present, right? To do your safety planning via text message with the survivor, if you have talked with them and identified, is it appropriate for us to text message? So what you're going to do is use your phone to safety plan around your communication prior to your first communication with the person, if that makes sense. The challenge that comes up for that is that we don't, what happens if you don't know, right? If you don't know domestic violence is present, if you don't know a person isn't safe in their home. And that's what we're creating some guidance around. Some of the best ideas that I've heard people talk about that I really liked was to do universal conversations. This is always our best practice. Talk to everybody about it and let them know this is something I talk to everyone about. And so you set that up as a conversation you're having every single time you're talking to anybody. And also you can add it to your like intake forms. You can add, check this box if you'd like to have a phone consult around, if you'd like to do a phone check-in prior to our meetings, like just kind of integrating it into your universal intake and your universal processes. So know that more guidance will be coming out to you all. If you'd like to join that conversation and weigh in and give us guidance and support from your own practice, I would really appreciate that. Rowan and I will set up a time for us to connect on that, but just know that we're working on that. And the best practice we have so far, use your phone to safety plan. If you know domestic, you're working with a survivor, and have a universal conversation around domestic and sexual violence with everyone. So that's the best practice we have right now.
Yep. Yep.
Carrie, did you have anything to add?
I think just really letting the survivor lead the conversation too. But just what Vanessa said, just say that I ask this of everyone, and maybe even before and after.
Yeah.
And listening for those patterns that come out.
Yeah.
But
Nirmala, would you add anything to that?
No, I'm not really. I have nothing else to add. Thank you. This was a great training today. I really appreciated the ton of information I learned.
Thank you. And just know, y'all, that we're our own practice community. So let's share what we learn to strengthen the movement, strengthen the field, strengthen all of our response to domestic violence. We're all learning and growing together.
yes. Okay.
Tara, did you have anything to add? I know you're doing a lot of healthcare stuff. Did you have anything to add about safety planning with telehealth or anything like that?
Thank you. I don't think so. I think this was really well covered. And then just to highlight that oftentimes safety planning is very unique to the situation. And so, and where our advocates, they do integrate this in the work and are pretty experts and proficient at it. So partnering with the DVSA agency and the advocate, and with our project, it's Marcy. And so, yeah, I really appreciated this training, and I really like that the model supports a lot of the health work in the model that we've been doing. And unfortunate, during COVID, we're not able to do an outstationed advocate on site, but hopefully with this partnership post-COVID, that will be something that we can work towards.
Thank you, Tara.
I have just one reminder for everyone to please complete the evaluation. I think they get it. Do they get it later, or do they get it right after this? I'm not sure, Terry. When do they
Right
get
now,
the evaluation?
they can click on that link. There's a link in the chat box. I'll go back also in the slide. If you want to type it in, you can, but you can just go right. Rowan popped it into the chat box. Little ways up.
And especially since we've ended 10 minutes early, if you can take that time to complete the evaluation, it would be so very much greatly appreciated. And just on a personal note, I want to thank all of the mental health partners who responded to my emails, and I see almost all of you are here today. I really, really appreciate it. And obviously, it also goes for our DV partners who attended, but I just wanted to kind of give my personal thanks to all of the mental health partners who are here today. So please take a moment. We have like 8 minutes before it's 3 o'clock. If you can complete the evaluation, we are hoping we get one from all of you who attended. We would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. And I know I just saw that Emily typed in, the link was very easy to use, and Rowan popped it in at the bottom again. So just in case you couldn't find it. And who doesn't want $50 to Amazon?
Yes. Carrie, were there any other questions that folks had?
We had one question that was just to me, and I'm going to let you all know. There was a question around if CEUs are going to be offered to staff for these, and we're working on it. That's a good question. I wanted to share it with everyone. So
Carrie, let me know if you need help getting that set up. That's something I do.
Okay. Yeah,
Constantly.
PSU, I believe Eliza, you and Karen were looking into it, and I just am not sure where we landed with it. So
okay.
Yeah, but yeah, so we can definitely look at that. And I think that's it, everybody. Thank you so much. I hope that you have a wonderful weekend. I'm also gonna put where, the website for the coalition on here in the chat box too, in case you want to get on there and start to look for our materials. There's Vanessa, her camera's
Yeah.
back on.
Bye, everyone. I just wanted to say goodbye and enjoy the snow. Have a great weekend. Enjoy your families. And see you next time.
Okay,
Bye-bye. Take care.
bye, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Rowan, will you stop recording?